Hi, this is Terry. Welcome back to my channel. Today's topic, I'm just going to start with a trigger warning on this. It was inspired by some news this week, and so it's going to be on miscarriage and stillbirth. And I'm hoping to be incredibly sensitive around this because I want us to be talking about this. And I truly admire what Chrissy Teigen posted around the loss of her child with John Legend this week, and I think she was more than halfway along, which puts it in the stillbirth category versus miscarriage, which happens before 20 weeks. I actually had to look that up. I did not know. But in the midst of their tragic and devastating loss, she posted on Instagram some pictures of what they were experiencing. And what I find so courageous about it is she is trying to make it so that we talk about something that unfortunately is much more common than most of us know about unless we've actually experienced a miscarriage, and then all of a sudden other women start talking about their experiences. So this was inspired by Chrissy Teigen and John Legend, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can go out to Instagram and follow her, and you can see some of her posts about their tragic loss this week. And I just thought it was a perfect opportunity to talk about. I experienced a miscarriage between Adam and Ray. It was probably about 5 weeks along, which is very typical. According to the data, and I had to do some research on this, most pregnancy losses, which of course are outside the control of women, 80% of them happen in the first trimester. So that's between 0 and 13 weeks. So my experience was not atypical. It was very normal. And even though it's generally outside of our control, it is not something that we ever do that contributes to this. There's still a lot of shame and there's some guilt, and we are encouraged to simply push through. We are taught to pretend that everything is just fine because it's not a visible loss. And so when you go through it and you experience it, it's not something we necessarily talk about. And I would like to change that. I would like to get on Chrissy's bandwagon and encourage more of us to talk about this. So last night on Clubhouse, I went ahead and I opened up a room, and I wanted to create a safe space for people to talk about miscarriage, grief, loss, and stillbirth. I was hoping to moderate it with Melanie, who is the savvy auntie, but unfortunately she wasn't available. But that doesn't mean that we aren't going to have another conversation about this, because she reminded me of a couple of things around circumstantial fertility, the grief and loss around not being able to have children if you want children. And she also told me something I didn't know, that Chrissy and John only have so many embryos. And so the loss of this baby may be the loss of the possibility of a bigger family. And that is one of the things we often don't talk about when we're talking about fertility journeys, fertility issues, and miscarriages, and the society's push to just start trying again. And I think a lot of us don't know how to talk about it with other people, and I'm going to say men and women, because last night on Clubhouse I was totally surprised by the fact that when I opened up the room, the first people to raise their hands to come and talk were men. One of the guys, his ex-wife had 2 miscarriages, and unfortunately the first miscarriage was followed very quickly by the death of his father that he struggled to deal with, and so they really didn't have a chance to grieve the loss of the first with the first miscarriage. And so then she got pregnant again, miscarried again. They were not in the same geographies. And I think what he implied is that really led to the end of their marriage. Another gentleman got up. His name is Sekou, and he is apparently a Grammy-nominated spoken word artist. And I didn't know who he was when he came up to talk. And he shared his journey with his wife, the 7-year fertility journey. And the good news is that 7 weeks ago, she gave birth to their first child, a daughter, but this was after 4 miscarriages. And she was so devastated after the second one, she said to her husband, Sekou, I feel broken. And so he wrote a spoken word piece that I'm going to put the link, YouTube link into the description. I have not yet watched it, but I'm very interested in seeing it. But it's called, what's it called? Flawless, what was it?
Where on your 17 and a half pages of notes?
There are 3 pages. It's called Flawlessly Fallen. So I'll go ahead and I'll put a link to that. I'm very interested in watching that as well. But it hadn't occurred to me that men would want to open up and talk about this, because oftentimes it's seen as a woman's issue. And it's a woman's issue that we are taught not to talk about. And so I was really surprised by that. I was also surprised, and I hadn't really thought about, there was one gal who shared how when she was in her early 20s, she had a miscarriage and she was relieved. She wasn't ready to be pregnant. And so with it, there were all sorts of complicated emotions around it, but there was a sense of relief with her miscarriage. And of course, she had, other guilt around feeling like it was a relief. And apparently where she comes from or how she was raised, there was some fear of punishment around this in getting pregnant in her early 20s and not at a more respectable age of, let's say, mid-20s. And so she prompted me when we were talking about grief and loss. She said, well, don't just assume that those are the only feelings that you can have, because for me, there was a sense of relief. And I love that she added that to the conversation. Two other gals shared how they were trying to support their mothers who had experienced miscarriages. In the case of one woman, her mom had experienced multiple miscarriages that led to her adoption. And so this other woman talked about how her mom has had multiple miscarriages. It sounds like may continue to be having miscarriages, and she doesn't know how to be there for her mother in supporting her in her grief. And so we touched on that a little bit, because once again, we don't talk about how we can support others. Oftentimes it's so uncomfortable for us that we want people to just get over it. Once again, because it's somewhat invisible to anyone but the person who's experiencing it. And for me, I remember I was in an IT department for a biotech company, and it was early on, and I remember being out on a bike ride with a bunch of guys and at lunch and just saying, yeah, I'm fine, it's no big deal, because that's how I thought I needed to be. It didn't occur to me that I could have feelings of grief and feelings of loss, and also deal with the hormonal changes that I went through. It was about a month or two later, I was like, oh yeah, I was not in a good place, and I really didn't know it because I thought I needed to just push through it. There was another woman who brought up the story of, she was pregnant with her 3rd child, and she had a friend who was pregnant with her 1st, and they were both going in to deliver at the same time, and there were complications, and the other woman went home without a baby. And the friend who had had her 3rd child was really hoping that they could, they went through pregnancy together, going through delivery not too far from each other, and then having postpartum experience together, and their kids growing up together and having playmates. And so there's a loss for her, and at the same time she was trying to be supportive of her friend who had a major and significant loss. And this gal was afraid that every time that she'd be around the woman who lost her baby, that somehow that would be a very painful reminder, and maybe it would be better to stay away. And this is where it gets hard, because our friends who lost their 2-year-old recently, one of the things that I've made sure to do is mention her name and talk about her so that she's not forgotten. And I don't know if that would be helpful for this other woman or not, but it's some of the things that I learned about when I interviewed some folks in the grief space last November and December, that it, and I mentioned it to my friend Morgan, who lost her 2-year-old when they were leaving a couple weeks ago. I asked her if she was okay if I talked about Lenny, if it was okay for me to ask about, and she said, yeah, absolutely. I don't want her to be forgotten. And I know most people are afraid of making it more painful for me. And she said, this is such a painful experience. There's nothing that can create any more pain, which is, I think, something that's a good thing for us to remember. So one of the other things that I did a teeny tiny bit of research around this, and one of the articles that I read talked about how, with and I'll look at some data here real quick, that miscarriage is not an abnormality. It really is the norm. 30 to 40% of all fertilized eggs miscarry, and often before the pregnancy is known. And 1 in 4 pregnancies end in miscarriage. And I think 1 in 4 women will experience, at least in the US, will experience miscarriage once in their lives, whether they know it or not. So it's just a really interesting thing that we don't talk about, and I would like to have us talk more about, so that not that we can normalize the experience around miscarriage, but we can normalize the conversation and bring it out into the open, so that women and men don't have to suffer silently in something that is, may or may not be tragic, could be a relief, but it is something that is just part of life. Oh, one of the other things that came up during the conversation, and Ray, this might be of interest because we had you go to Stanford for the heart-to-heart program.
Oh God, that.
So there was one of the gals asked, why don't we have more discussion about our bodies, especially our female parts, etc., to have greater awareness about these kinds of things, so when they happen, it's not a complete surprise. And it's like, well, where do you start with that conversation? I don't think this was touched on in the heart-to-heart, was it?
Was what?
Miscarriage. No, there was. Did any?
We barely talked about pregnancy.
Yeah, well, because you were what, 11?
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
I was a wee lad.
But the one of the gals talked about having endometriosis, and it would have been nice to know earlier on that could create some other complications, what that shows up as. Fibroid cysts is something that we don't necessarily talk about. PCOS. I mean, there's just so much that we don't talk about with women's reproductive health that, it's really something to start thinking about. But I think it's largely because so much is written by men, and it's not we women are not necessarily taken into account, or our female bodies are not necessarily taken into account. There's far too little research and development and innovation and investment in this, and I would like to see, I've been talking about this for a number of years, and I would like to see more money and interest go to women's health, for lack of a better term, or femtech, or into these areas, so we have a better understanding about how our bodies operate, and so that we can normalize the conversations and the experiences around things that are more normal than atypical. So I think that's all I have. Ray, let's do the check-in with Ray. I have to say, this has been really disconcerting to have you just sit over there and read while I'm doing this. Usually I like to have a little bit of banter, and you've read this book before, like 4 times.
More than 4 times.
Oh, okay, so check in with Finn. What do we got?
I'm reading a book.
What are you reading?
Oh, Jerusalem by Laurie R. King.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites, so I can understand why you're obsessed with it. It would have been nice to have, 14 minutes of your attention, but, I guess that's too much to ask. It says we're at under 14.
Congratulations. I was looking at the clock because I have class in about 10-15
Yeah,
minutes.
I've got a client call as well.
Cool. So we can wrap this up?
Just about. Let me just double check my notes really quick. I was hoping you'd do the check-in with Finn and give me a chance to look at my notes, but what are you doing this weekend?
Homework.
Are we back to monosyllabic responses again?
Probably.
You're such a fucker.
I didn't sign up for this shit.
Okay, so I guess to wrap it all up, I appreciate Chrissy Teigen's courage in sharing what it is that she shared. I'm a big fan of hers, and I like that she speaks out and gets us talking about things. Some people are not happy about it, but in this case, I'm hoping that we can normalize conversations and be better about supporting each other and ourselves as we experience this kind of loss and grief. So with that, thank you so much for watching, and thank you for subscribing. My goal is to get to 200 subscribers by the end of the year. We're at 170, so at this rate we may actually get there. So it'd be really helpful if you think someone might appreciate this episode, especially if you could share it with them and ask them to subscribe and watch as well. Watch and subscribe, maybe that's the order. And with that, since that one's not being very helpful, I think I got a really loud eye roll.
I did not roll my eyes. I simply looked at you with an eyebrow raised.
Okay, let go of perfection, take some risks, and above all else, have some fun.